Ma'am, move to the back of the line. Priority boarding is for passengers who actually belong here. The words rang across gate C-18 with the kind of confidence that only comes from someone who believes they will never be questioned. Conversations faded. Rolling suitcases slowed. Coffee cups paused halfway to waiting hands. Nearly every traveler within earshot turned toward the woman standing quietly near the priority boarding sign. Danielle Brooks didn't react. She simply looked down at the boarding pass resting between her fingers, then glanced at the digital screen above the gate that confirmed Flight 428 to San Francisco was boarding exactly on schedule. The airport around her buzzed with the familiar rhythm of a Monday morning. Families hurried toward connecting flights. Business travelers answered emails before takeoff. Children laughed as planes taxied past enormous windows reflecting the early sunlight. Everything moved exactly as it should, except for the silence surrounding Danielle. She stood in a charcoal hoodie, faded blue jeans, white sneakers, and a small black backpack slung over one shoulder. There were no designer labels, no security detail, no assistant carrying a leather portfolio. Nothing about her appearance suggested she was preparing to make one of the most important business decisions of the year. Rebecca Collins, the gate agent wearing a crisp Navy Airline uniform, folded her arms and pointed toward the back of the boarding area. Economy passengers wait over there. You're slowing everyone else down. Her voice wasn't loud because she needed to be heard. It was loud because she wanted everyone else to hear it. Danielle slowly raised her eyes. They were calm, steady, almost curious. My boarding group is priority, she said evenly, holding out the pass without taking a single step forward. Rebecca barely glanced at it before pushing it gently back toward Danielle. I know what priority passengers look like. A few people exchanged uncomfortable looks. One businessman frowned but stayed silent. An older woman lowered the magazine she had been reading. A college student removed one earbud, sensing the conversation was about to become something bigger than delayed boarding. Danielle slipped the boarding pass back into her hand without arguing. Her expression never changed. She had seen this look before. Not this airport. Not this employee. Just the same certainty behind unfamiliar eyes. The certainty that appearances could tell an entire story. Rebecca reached for the scanner on the counter and called for the next traveler instead, deliberately looking past Danielle as though she had already disappeared. Next priority passenger, she announced. A middle-aged white couple stepped around Danielle without hesitation. Rebecca greeted them with an effortless smile, scanned their passes, wished them a pleasant flight, and thanked them for their loyalty. The contrast lingered in the air longer than any spoken accusation. Danielle remained exactly where she was, one hand resting lightly on the strap of her backpack, watching the boarding bridge through the open doorway ahead. She wasn't impatient. She wasn't embarrassed. If anything, she looked as though she were waiting for something far more important than an airplane. Around her, the gate slowly transformed from an ordinary departure area into a room full of witnesses, though none of them realized they were about to watch a decision that would ripple far beyond a single flight. Rebecca believed she had just moved one passenger to the back of a line. She had no idea she had just placed the entire airline partnership standing at the very front of it. Danielle Brooks had spent the last 23 years building a reputation that never depended on expensive clothes, reserved parking spaces, or people recognizing her face. At 47 years old, she had led Nexera Technologies from a regional software company into one of the nation's most influential infrastructure partners, helping modernize airport operations, logistics systems, and passenger technology across the country. Success had taught her something few executives ever understood. The higher people climbed, the easier it became to forget what ordinary customers actually experienced. That was why she traveled this way whenever she could. No private jet, no executive escort, no advance calls announcing her arrival. Just one carry-on backpack, one commercial ticket purchased under her legal name, and one opportunity to see the company behind the polished advertisements. This trip mattered more than anyone at Gate C-18 could possibly imagine. Less than 3 hours after landing in San Francisco, Danielle was scheduled to meet with the airline's executive leadership to finalize a 5-year strategic partnership worth hundreds of millions of dollars. The agreement would introduce Nexera's next-generation passenger experience platform into airports across the country, changing everything from boarding verification to customer service analytics. The board wanted signatures. Investors expected photographs. News outlets were already preparing announcements. Danielle wanted something much simpler before putting her name on the contract. She wanted proof that the airline's culture matched the promises printed in its annual reports. Respect could not exist only inside conference rooms. It had to exist at boarding gates, check-in counters, customer service desks, and every place where strangers placed their trust in the company. Weeks earlier, anonymous customer complaints had landed on her desk. Most described subtle moments that never appeared in official reports. Travelers claimed they were questioned more aggressively because of how they looked. Some said they were ignored while others received immediate assistance. None of the complaints alone proved a pattern, but together they painted a picture Danielle could not ignore. Rather than sending consultants or auditors, she decided to see everything herself. Nobody outside her closest executive team knew she would be on this flight. Even her calendar listed the morning as private travel time. She preferred it that way. Truth revealed itself when nobody realized they were being observed. Standing quietly near the boarding lane, Danielle watched Rebecca Collins greet each passenger with carefully measured enthusiasm. Some received warm smiles before their boarding passes even reached the scanner. Others were welcomed by name after a quick glance at the screen. Danielle noticed small details that many people overlooked. Tone changed. Patience changed. Assumptions changed. None of it happened loudly enough to trigger an official complaint. Yet each interaction left behind an impression that numbers on a quarterly report could never capture. Danielle adjusted the strap on her backpack and glanced through the terminal windows as another aircraft lifted into the bright morning sky. She remembered the promise she had made to herself years earlier after becoming chief executive officer. Never allow success to place distance between yourself and the people your company serves. If leadership only listened inside boardrooms, it would eventually become deaf everywhere else. Behind the boarding counter, Rebecca believed she had already identified exactly what kind of passenger Danielle was. Danielle, however, was quietly discovering exactly what kind of partner the airline might become. Rebecca Collins glanced toward the growing boarding line, then looked back at Danielle with the same confident smile she had offered every passenger except the one standing directly in front of her. "Ma'am, I have already explained this once. You are delaying everyone else. Please step aside until we can determine whether your boarding pass is valid." Danielle handed over the boarding pass without a word. Rebecca took it between two fingers, studying it for only a second before placing it on the counter instead of scanning it. "Interesting," she said. "Priority boarding. That is unusual." Danielle met her eyes calmly. "The scanner can answer that question faster than either of us." Rebecca ignored the suggestion. Instead, she pressed a button beneath the counter. Within moments, a man wearing a supervisor badge approached the gate. His name tag read Thomas Whitaker. He was in his early 50s, neatly dressed, and carried the practiced expression of someone accustomed to resolving customer complaints before they became visible. Rebecca spoke before he had the chance to ask a single question. "This passenger insists on remaining in the priority line, but something about the ticket does not seem right." Thomas turned toward Danielle. "Good morning, ma'am. May I see another form of identification?" Danielle quietly removed her driver's license from her wallet and handed it over. Thomas compared the identification to the boarding pass, then frowned, not because anything failed to match, but because Rebecca continued watching him with obvious expectation. "Have you traveled with us before?" he asked. Danielle smiled politely. "Many times." Rebecca folded her arms. "That is difficult to believe." Nearby, a man in an expensive business suit chuckled just loudly enough for others to hear. Some people think standing in the right line makes them belong there. A few travelers shifted uncomfortably. Others looked down at their phones, pretending not to notice. Danielle did not acknowledge the remark. She simply waited. Thomas looked back toward Rebecca. "Did the boarding pass fail during check-in?" Rebecca hesitated for half a second before answering. "I have not scanned it yet." Thomas blinked. "Then we do not actually know whether there is a problem." Rebecca lowered her voice, although everyone nearby could still hear her. "Sometimes experience tells you more than a scanner does." Danielle noticed several faces turn toward Rebecca after those words. The sentence lingered in the air because everyone understood exactly what it implied without anyone saying it directly. Thomas finally reached for the boarding pass himself. Before he could place it beneath the scanner, Rebecca stopped him with a gentle motion of her hand. Let us verify everything first. Danielle remained perfectly still. Every unnecessary delay, every additional request, every assumption was quietly writing its own record. Across the waiting area, a young airline employee organizing wheelchair assistance paused long enough to glance at the boarding screen. His eyes narrowed slightly as he looked back toward Danielle, then toward the supervisor. Something about the passenger's name seemed familiar. Before he could step closer, another boarding announcement echoed through the terminal, and more travelers gathered around the gate. The ordinary rhythm of the airport continued, but inside the boarding area an invisible line had already been drawn. Rebecca believed she was protecting airline procedure. Danielle understood she was witnessing something much larger than procedure. She was watching assumptions replace policy one decision at a time, and with every passing minute the cost of those assumptions quietly continued to grow. The young airline employee standing several yards away could not shake the feeling that he had seen the name before. Jordan Ellis had been with the airline for barely 8 months, working mostly behind the scenes helping coordinate passenger assistance and boarding logistics. He was still new enough to pay attention when experienced employees overlooked details. As he glanced again toward the boarding counter, he caught a brief glimpse of the boarding pass lying face up on the desk before Rebecca casually covered part of it with her hand. The name Danielle Brooks stood out for only a moment, but it was enough to stir a memory. Jordan quietly walked toward a nearby service terminal, signed into the internal flight system, and searched the passenger list assigned to Flight 428. Within seconds, the reservation appeared exactly as printed on the boarding pass. Priority boarding. Executive status. Verified identification. No travel alerts. No payment issues. Every indicator on the screen showed green. Jordan looked back toward the counter, confused. There was nothing unusual about the reservation at all. Before he could speak, another passenger stepped closer to Rebecca. An older woman wearing a navy business suit watched the exchange with growing concern. "Excuse me," she said politely. "If her boarding pass is valid, why is she still standing here?" Rebecca answered without looking up. "We are handling an internal verification." The woman frowned. "It looks like she has been waiting longer than everyone else." Thomas shifted uneasily, but remained silent. He seemed caught between trusting procedure and trusting the judgment of the employee who insisted something was wrong. Jordan finally approached the supervisor. "Sir," he said quietly, careful not to interrupt the boarding process. "I checked the passenger manifest. Everything matches." Rebecca immediately turned toward him. "Jordan, this does not involve you." He hesitated. "I understand, but the reservation appears completely normal." Rebecca forced a smile that never reached her eyes. "Thank you. We have more information than what appears on your screen." Jordan knew that explanation did not make sense. There was no hidden warning, no restricted status, no instruction requiring additional review. The reservation looked exactly like hundreds of other executive travelers he had processed during the past several months. Across the seating area, another traveler, Emily Parker, lowered her laptop after listening to the conversation. She quietly opened the camera on her phone, but kept it lowered near her lap. She was not trying to embarrass anyone. She simply believed that when confusion unfolded in public, facts mattered more than opinions. Danielle noticed neither phone nor whispers. Her attention remained fixed on the people making decisions in front of her. Calm had become her greatest advantage. Every unnecessary comment from the airline staff filled the silence she refused to break. Thomas finally cleared his throat. "Rebecca, perhaps we should simply scan the boarding pass." Rebecca shook her head. "Not until I am satisfied." Jordan looked from the scanner to the reservation screen still glowing on the nearby terminal. One simple scan would end the entire situation in less than 2 seconds, yet nobody seemed willing to take that obvious step. Around the gate, more travelers had begun paying attention than boarding. Some exchanged puzzled looks. Others quietly questioned why a routine boarding process had become an extended investigation without any visible reason. Danielle stood exactly where she had been from the beginning, patient, composed, almost as though she expected truth to reveal itself eventually. Jordan realized something that unsettled him. The longer this continued, the less it resembled caution and the more it resembled assumption. Without realizing it, the witnesses gathering around Gate C-18 were beginning to reach the very same conclusion. Rebecca's patience finally gave way to something sharper than authority. She stepped around the boarding counter until she was standing only a few feet from Danielle. The conversations around gate C-18 grew quieter, replaced by the uneasy awareness that everyone was watching the same moment unfold. "Ma'am," Rebecca said, extending her arm toward the seating area, "I am asking you one last time to wait over there until we finish our review." Her hand briefly rested against Danielle's sleeve, more a gesture of direction than force, but enough to transform an uncomfortable exchange into something no longer routine. Danielle looked down at the hand for only a moment before raising her eyes again. "Please do not touch me," she said calmly. Her voice remained measured, almost gentle, carrying none of the anger many people expected. Rebecca immediately withdrew her hand but refused to step back. "Then cooperate," she answered. "You are making this much more difficult than it needs to be." Thomas shifted his weight uneasily. He opened his mouth as if preparing to end the situation by scanning the boarding pass himself, yet hesitation won once again. Procedure had already been replaced by uncertainty, and uncertainty was quietly feeding poor judgment. Jordan watched from several feet away, unable to understand why no one would simply trust the airline's own system. Emily continued recording discreetly, keeping her phone low while capturing only the voices and the counter. Around them, passengers no longer focused on boarding. They focused on fairness. Danielle remained perfectly still, but inside her mind another airport slowly came into focus. 25 years earlier, when she was only 22, she had stood at another gate wearing her first tailored business suit after saving for months to afford a first-class upgrade. She still remembered the excitement of believing she had finally reached a milestone that once seemed impossible. Before boarding began, an employee had looked at her ticket, then at her face, then quietly asked whether she had entered the wrong boarding lane. The ticket had been valid then too. The silence from nearby passengers had been just as loud. She remembered stepping aside without protest because she believed someone would eventually notice the mistake. No one ever did. She flew home that day, wondering whether success would always arrive one step behind other people's assumptions. The memory faded as quickly as it appeared. Danielle returned her attention to the present, where the same pattern stood in front of her, wearing a different uniform and speaking with a different voice. The years between those two airports suddenly felt much shorter than they should have. Rebecca folded her arms again. "If necessary, we can request airport security to assist with this situation." A murmur spread through the waiting area. Thomas looked surprised by the suggestion. "Rebecca, I do not believe that is necessary." "I do," she replied without taking her eyes off Danielle. Jordan took one cautious step forward. "Sir, the reservation is verified. I checked it myself." Rebecca turned toward him immediately. "Jordan, return to your assignment." He hesitated but did not move. Danielle reached into the pocket of her hoodie and slowly removed her phone. There was no rush, no frustration, no dramatic gesture. She unlocked the screen, searched one familiar contact, and rested her thumb above the call button. Looking directly at Rebecca, she offered the smallest hint of a smile, not one of satisfaction, but of certainty. "Thank you," she said quietly. "I have seen everything I needed to see." Danielle pressed the call button and lifted the phone to her ear as the uneasy silence around gate C-18 grew even heavier. She did not raise her voice. She did not step closer to the counter. She simply waited. The call connected after the first ring. "Good morning, Monica," she said with the same calm tone she had used throughout the entire encounter. "Please activate Protocol 7. There was no confusion on the other end. Monica Hayes had served as Danielle's executive assistant for nearly a decade. She recognized those two words immediately because they had never been used casually. "Understood," Monica replied. "Would you like the full executive response?" Danielle looked through the large terminal windows where another aircraft rolled toward the runway. "Yes. Begin documentation immediately. Notify legal affairs, corporate partnerships, and executive risk management. Preserve every available record connected to Gate C-18, including customer service logs, boarding activity, surveillance footage, and employee communications beginning 15 minutes before boarding." Monica answered without hesitation. "Already in progress. Would you like me to contact the airline executive office?" Danielle replied quietly, "Not yet. Give them a chance to finish making their own decisions." Rebecca exchanged an amused glance with Thomas after hearing only Danielle's side of the conversation. Calling customer service is not going to change airline policy, she said with quiet confidence. Danielle slipped the phone away from her ear for only a moment. I agree, she answered. This is not about changing policy. Rebecca smiled politely, believing she had won the exchange. Then I suggest you wait until our review is complete. Danielle nodded once. That is exactly what I intend to do. On the other end of the call, Monica had already opened a secure executive conference channel. Within moments, Nexera Technologies' general counsel joined the call, followed by the vice president responsible for transportation partnerships. A compliance specialist began creating a detailed timeline based on Danielle's live updates. No accusations were entered, only observable facts. Time of arrival, boarding status, employee names, statements made in front of witnesses, requests for verification, refusal to scan a valid boarding pass. Each detail became part of a record that depended on evidence rather than emotion. Monica then opened another file marked Airline Partnership Renewal. At the top of the page appeared the scheduled meeting in San Francisco, less than 3 hours away. Representatives from both organizations had expected a ceremonial signing accompanied by press photographs and executive speeches. Monica quietly added one new note beneath the agenda. Executive review pending. Back at the gate, Jordan watched Danielle carefully. There was nothing theatrical about her behavior. No threats. No raised voice. No attempt to embarrass anyone. That unusual restraint unsettled him more than anger would have. Emily lowered her phone for a moment and whispered to the passenger beside her. She acts like she knows something nobody else knows. The man nodded slowly. Or like she has nothing left to prove. Thomas looked toward Rebecca again. Perhaps we should simply scan the boarding pass and move forward. Rebecca shook her head before he could reach for it. We finish this my way. Danielle heard every word but offered no response. She simply returned the phone to her ear as Monica spoke again. Everything is ready. The executive response team is standing by for your authorization. Danielle answered with complete composure. Keep everyone where they are. The lesson is still unfolding. Around gate C-18, passengers believed they were witnessing an ordinary boarding dispute stretching far longer than necessary. None of them realized that while the airline employees continued focusing on one traveler standing quietly beside the boarding lane, an entirely different process had already begun hundreds of miles away, moving with the precision of people who understood that real authority rarely announced itself before it arrived. Rebecca folded her arms with renewed confidence, convinced the quiet woman standing before her had finally accepted that nothing was going to change. The boarding line continued moving around Danielle, one passenger after another crossing the scanner, while curious eyes kept drifting back toward the small circle forming near the counter. Thomas looked increasingly uncomfortable. Jordan remained only a few steps away, unable to ignore what the reservation system had already confirmed. Emily slipped her phone into her purse but stayed exactly where she was, sensing the story had not reached its turning point. Danielle's phone vibrated softly. She answered without looking at the screen. Yes, Monica. Her assistant's voice remained composed. The airline executive office has been informed that the partnership meeting has been placed on immediate review pending your instructions. They are requesting clarification. Danielle replied with only 6 words. Tell them to come to gate C-18. Monica answered instantly. They are on their way. Rebecca smiled politely after overhearing only fragments of the conversation. I hope whoever you called understands that boarding will not wait forever. Danielle met her eyes with the same calm expression she had carried since arriving at the gate. Neither does accountability. Before Rebecca could answer, hurried footsteps echoed across the terminal. 3 people in dark business suits appeared from the direction of the executive offices, moving with unmistakable urgency. The man leading them wore an airport executive identification badge and scanned the boarding area until his eyes settled on Danielle. His pace immediately quickened. Rebecca instinctively straightened her uniform, assuming the executives had arrived to support her decision. Thomas stepped aside, relieved that someone higher in authority would finally resolve the situation. The executive stopped directly in front of Danielle, his expression shifting from concern to embarrassment. Ms. Brooks, he said respectfully, extending his hand. I am David Reynolds, Regional Vice President. I am deeply sorry to have kept you waiting. The boarding area fell completely silent. Rebecca stared at him without understanding. Thomas blinked twice, as though trying to process what he had just heard. Jordan lowered his eyes for a brief moment, realizing his instincts had been correct from the beginning. David continued speaking. Our chief executive officer is already on a secure conference call. He was expecting to welcome you personally in San Francisco. Danielle shook his hand politely. I appreciate you coming. David glanced toward Rebecca and Thomas before looking back at Danielle. May I ask what happened? Danielle answered without anger, exaggeration, or accusation. I presented a valid boarding pass. I was told I did not belong in the priority line. My ticket was questioned before it was scanned. My identity was doubted before it was verified. Your employee chose assumptions before procedure. No one interrupted her because every witness standing nearby had watched each moment unfold exactly as she described it. Rebecca finally found her voice. Sir, we were only following policy. David turned slowly toward her. Policy begins by scanning a valid boarding pass. His words landed with quiet precision. Danielle then looked at David and spoke the sentence that changed the meaning of the entire morning. I am Danielle Brooks, Chief Executive Officer of Nexera Technologies. My team was flying to San Francisco today to finalize the renewal of our national partnership with your airline. Before signing that agreement, I wanted to experience your customer service exactly as any passenger would. The silence that followed seemed to stop the entire terminal. Every conversation disappeared. Every rolling suitcase paused. Rebecca's confidence dissolved into disbelief as she realized the woman she had repeatedly asked to leave the priority line was not simply another traveler. She was the executive whose signature would determine whether the airline's largest technology partnership moved forward at all. For several long seconds, nobody spoke. The boarding scanner sat untouched. The line had stopped moving. Even the announcements echoing through the terminal seemed distant compared to the silence that had settled over gate C18. David Reynolds slowly lowered his hand, then turned toward Rebecca and Thomas. Is everything Ms. Brooks described accurate? Neither of them answered immediately. Thomas glanced toward the boarding counter where the untouched boarding pass still rested exactly where Rebecca had placed it nearly 20 minutes earlier. Jordan stepped forward carefully. Sir, I verified her reservation in the system. Everything matched. Priority boarding, executive status, valid identification. I informed them before boarding continued. David nodded once, then looked back at Rebecca. Did anyone ever scan her boarding pass? Rebecca's face had lost all confidence. No, she admitted quietly. I believed additional review was appropriate. David asked the next question without raising his voice. Based on what company policy? Rebecca searched for an answer that never came. There had been no system alert, no security notification, no irregularity in the reservation. Only an assumption that had grown stronger each time it went unchallenged. Danielle remained silent, allowing the facts to stand on their own. Her phone vibrated once more. Monica's voice came through clearly. The executive committee is assembled. Legal has completed the preliminary timeline. The partnership agreement has been placed on hold pending your final decision. Danielle answered calmly. Thank you. Please join the conference. Within moments, David's phone rang. He glanced at the screen and answered immediately. The airline's chief executive officer appeared on speaker. David, I have just reviewed the initial report. Is Ms. Brooks with you? Yes, David replied. She is standing beside me. Then please place me on speaker. David complied. The executive's voice carried across the silent gate. Ms. Brooks, on behalf of our airline, I sincerely apologize for what you experienced this morning. We value our relationship with Nexera Technologies and hope we can address this properly. Danielle listened without interrupting. When the apology ended, she finally spoke. I appreciate your willingness to respond quickly. However, partnerships are built on trust long before they are built on contracts. This morning I watched your procedures ignored, your own reservation system questioned without evidence, and a customer evaluated by appearance before policy. Those decisions were made without pressure, without confusion, and without urgency. They reflected culture, not circumstance. No one around the gate moved. Every passenger seemed to understand they were witnessing something far larger than a delayed boarding process. Danielle continued. For that reason, I am instructing Nexera Technologies to suspend today's partnership signing effective immediately. My executive team will begin reviewing alternative airline partners whose customer experience aligns with the standards we expect from organizations representing our technology. David closed his eyes briefly. Rebecca stared at the floor. Thomas removed his supervisor badge from around his neck as though its weight had suddenly become much heavier. The airline chief executive officer responded quietly. I understand your decision. We will begin a full internal review today. David turned toward Rebecca and Thomas. Effective immediately, both of you are relieved from customer-facing duties pending that review. Jordan, you will assist our operations team with documenting today's events. Thank you for speaking up. Jordan nodded silently. Emily slipped her phone back into her purse without posting a single word. She realized the truth no longer needed a recording to carry its own weight. Around gate C-18, the passengers slowly began boarding again, but nothing about the atmosphere resembled the ordinary morning that had existed only a short time before. The greatest consequence had not come from a raised voice or public confrontation. It had come from one quiet decision made by a woman who understood that real leadership never confused power with dignity and never allowed either one to exist without accountability. The boarding announcement resumed, but the atmosphere at gate C-18 had changed in a way no schedule could repair. Passengers walked across the jet bridge more quietly than before, many glancing back one last time at Danielle Brooks, as though they had witnessed something they would remember long after the flight ended. David Reynolds stood beside her with genuine regret written across his face. Ms. Brooks, he said softly, I hope someday we earn another opportunity to demonstrate who we truly want to be. Danielle gave a small nod. That opportunity begins with the next passenger who walks through this terminal, not with me. Her words carried no bitterness. They carried responsibility. David understood the difference immediately. Thomas stepped forward, his voice heavy with reflection rather than defense. I should have trusted the system instead of my hesitation. I am sorry. Danielle looked at him for a brief moment. Leadership is not measured by how long we hold authority. It is measured by how quickly we choose what is right when the answer is already in front of us. Thomas lowered his eyes, knowing those words would stay with him far longer than any formal review. Rebecca remained silent. The certainty that had shaped every decision earlier that morning had disappeared, replaced by the realization that assumptions often reveal more about the person making them than the person receiving them. Jordan quietly approached Danielle before she boarded. Thank you, he said. She smiled gently. For what? He answered without hesitation. For proving that speaking up matters, even when you are the newest person in the room. Danielle nodded. Never underestimate quiet honesty. Organizations improve because people choose integrity before convenience. Emily walked over with her laptop tucked beneath one arm. I recorded part of what happened, she admitted. Would you like me to send it to your office? Danielle shook her head politely. If the airline is serious about improving, they already have everything they need. Change built on truth lasts longer than change built on embarrassment. Emily smiled, understanding exactly what she meant. As Danielle stepped toward the boarding bridge, Monica called one final time. The executive committee has confirmed your decision. Several transportation companies have already requested meetings this afternoon. Danielle looked through the large terminal windows where the morning sun reflected across the runway. Schedule them for tomorrow. Today is not about replacing one partnership with another. Today is about remembering why partnerships matter in the first place. She ended the call and took a slow step toward the aircraft. Behind her, Gate C-18 gradually returned to its ordinary rhythm. New passengers arrived. New flights appeared on the departure board. Employees resumed their work. Yet something invisible had changed inside the people who had witnessed the morning unfold. Jordan would remember that procedure exists to protect fairness, not replace it. Thomas would remember that silence in the face of doubt carries its own consequences. David would return to the executive office with a clearer understanding that culture is experienced long before it is described in annual reports. And Rebecca would carry a lesson that no training manual could teach by itself. Danielle never looked back as she entered the jet bridge. She had not raised her voice. She had not demanded respect. She had simply allowed every choice to reveal itself until the truth became impossible to ignore. Before disappearing from view, she paused for only a second and spoke words that the people nearest to her would never forget. Titles can open boardroom doors, but character opens every other one. Respect should never depend on discovering who someone is after you have already decided how to treat them. Then she continued toward the aircraft, leaving behind more than a canceled partnership. She left behind a higher standard for everyone who had watched one quiet passenger remind an entire organization that dignity is never a privilege reserved for the recognized. It is the minimum every person deserves the moment they arrive.